In this lecture, we'll discuss the principles that govern how we feed performance horses. We'll begin with a basic review of cellular metabolism, and then we'll discuss how we can use different nutrient substrates with our macronutrients in order to feed our performance horses. Finally, we'll end the lecture by discussing the dietary management of different equine musculoskeletal diseases. To get into a little bit more detail about the lecture, we'll review cellular metabolism, including glycolysis and glycogenolysis, both in anaerobic and aerobic conditions. We'll also discuss fatty acid oxidation. We'll have a brief review of muscle fiber types and the energetic substrates used by the different muscle fiber types, including slow and fast twitch muscles. Then we'll discuss feeding principles for the athletic horse. Nutrient requirements will be discussed for energy, protein, lipid, carbohydrates, as well as vitamins and minerals. And finally, we'll review the dietary management for horses that have PSSM and RER. As equine veterinarians and nutritionists, we have a very unique type of animal that we work with. There are a wide variety of different horse breeds that have a great variety of different athletic activities that they work under. Our goals for these animals are to help optimize the athletic activity for the individual horse. We'll want to help our clients select optimal nutrients, and the nutrients that they select for their animal will depend on the duration and the intensity of the horse's exercise. We'll also want to consider the timing and feeding of the horse in order to help optimize the horse's performance. When we think of our 3-day eventing horses, we have horses that are competing at very high levels and very strenuous exercises over a long period of time. And it'll be really important for these horses not only to maintain their hydration, but to have them replete their glycogen stores within their muscles over their long period of exercise. When we work with horses that have a more robust and explosive type of activity, like our quarter horses, again, we're going to have to think of the conditions that they're working under. Maybe they're working under more anaerobic conditions with a great burst of energy. So use of glucose in the stored form as glycogen may be even more important than our horses that are using nutrients in a longer, more slow metabolism. We then have our thoroughbred racehorses that have a short duration of maximal intensity exercise. And at the other end of the spectrum, we can think of our Arabian horses and horses that are used for endurance type of activity. And these horses often will work for long periods of time, sometimes on 25-mile races, 50-mile races, and then in the case of the Tevis Cup race, it's 100 miles in a 24-hour period. This is one photo from the Tevis Cup race, which is held in the Sierra Nevada, usually in August. This is just showing you the different terrain that these horses move over. So when we're thinking about our athletes, we not only have to think of the intensity of the exercise, but the type of ground that they're moving over. Are they on flat work? Are they jumping? Are they on rocks? What kind of activity are they doing? And again, just to give you a little bit of a better profile of what these horses are doing, some of them will go over the high hills that you see on the left. You have another different paths that a horse can take on the right in the photo that's shown on the slide. This graph just shows the different elevations of a horse in the Tevis race. They're starting at around 7,200 feet. Again, this is in the Sierra Nevada. And over the 100 miles, they're slowly going to work their way down to a level of about 1,200 feet in the town of Auburn. But you can see a lot of declining and then climbing throughout the day. And so these horses will go through multiple vet checks within the period of the race, usually around 24 hours. And the horses that are the most successful are the ones that come in well nourished, but usually no more than a body condition score of about 4.5. You rarely see them above a 5. The horses will be able to maintain their hydration, their electrolyte status, and they'll be able to maintain their energy stores throughout the entire race. And those are the horses that usually are the ones that end up winning. So now getting down to thinking about nutrition at the cellular level, and as we go on to talk about the nutrient requirements for our equine athletes, then we'll be able to relate the macronutrients that we actually feed the horse to what the horse is going to be using when it's exercising. So thinking about glycolysis, that's the process of utilization of glucose, which is our main energy source for our equine athletes. It can be used in two different ways. First, it can be oxidized in an aerobic condition when oxygen is present. This process occurs in the cytosol of the cell. And when oxygen is present, 32 ATPs are formed per glucose molecule. Anaerobic oxidation occurs when no oxygen is present. It's much less efficient, and so we would prefer our athletes to work in an aerobic condition, but that's not always possible. Anaerobic oxidation forms 2 ATPs per glucose molecule. Under anaerobic conditions, pyruvate is converted to lactate by pyruvate dehydrogenase, or PDH. Lactate will accumulate in the cell. Eventually, lactate can be transported to the liver to produce glucose. So that's another way to recycle glucose when lactate's produced in the muscle. Remember that glycogen is a storage form of glucose in the body, and glycogen is stored both in the muscle and in the liver, and the greatest location of glycogen storage in the horse's body will be in the muscle. Storage of glycogen is under hormonal regulation. In the fed state, insulin is released and glycogen is stored. When when the horse needs to have glycogen released, glucagon and epinephrine will be released, and then the process of glycogenolysis will happen, and so the glycogen molecules will be broken down, and glucose will be released back into the blood. So glycogen, remember, was going to be an essential energy reserve in our equine athletes. And our goal when we're feeding our athletes are to make sure that we provide them with a ration to promote glycogen storage, and not only promote the storage, but also to limit the use of glycogen during exercise. So thinking about using glycogen as a source of energy during exercise, a number of studies have been done that have looked at that, and the rate of glycogen use is actually related to work intensity, and that would make sense. Horses that are sprinted or trotted have a depletion of muscle glycogen by about 30%, and this was found in thoroughbreds sprinting between 8 to 2,000 meters, or standardbreds trotting at 1,600 meters. 3-day eventing horses that were evaluated on day 2 had a depletion of their muscle glycogen by 60%. In endurance horses, a variety of studies have been done finding different levels of glycogen depletion. One study found a depletion of muscle glycogen by 50 to 75% between 80 to 160 kilometers of racing. Another study found a partial or complete depletion of muscle glycogen at 50 to 100 kilometers. And then yet another study found that horses developed hypoglycemia following complete glycogen depletion during an endurance rate of 72 kilometers. Now, hypoglycemia is very rare in horses and will only occur as far as our athletes are occurred if glycogen is depleted. Obviously, we don't want our equine athletes to ever approach a period of complete glycogen depletion and hypoglycemia. So it's our job when we're feeding them and when we're training our equine athletes to try and prevent it from happening. So the rate of glycogen use will be also related to our preliminary exercise that we give our equine athletes. Warm-up exercise decreases the rate of muscle glycogen degradation. So it's not just a good idea to help improve the blood flow to muscles and help the horse warm up for mechanical reasons, but it actually helps to reduce the rate that muscle will use glycogen. Exercise training results in increased concentrations of glycogen in resting muscles after several weeks of exercise training. It also results in increased oxidative capacity of muscle and a progressive decrease in the rate of glycogen use during submaximal exercise. So there are a lot of good reasons why we want to have our horses train When we have oxidative capacity of muscle increase, that means we have more blood flow to the muscle, and that means hopefully the horse can work in a more aerobic condition, and more ATP can be derived from each glucose molecule that's used. Now for fatty acid oxidation, we're now moving from glucose into the use of fatty acids. Triglycerides are also going to be a very important energy source for our equine athletes. Triglycerides are stored in peripheral tissues, both in adipose and in muscle tissues. And they're stored as triacylglycerols or tags, and that is composed of 3 fatty acids and a glycerol backbone. Our triglycerides are under hormonal regulation as well. In the fed state, when insulin has been released, they will be stored. During the period of fasting or during exercise, there's a decline in insulin. That decline in insulin will actually stimulate another enzyme called hormone-sensitive lipase, abbreviated as HSL on the slide. So when the hormone-sensitive lipase activity in adipose tissue increases, the hormone-sensitive lipase will hydrolyze the triacylglycerol in order to produce the glycerol backbone and the free fatty acids. Those will enter the bloodstream, and they'll be transported to the liver. Now, the glycerol backbone can be incorporated into glucose through the process of gluconeogenesis. The fatty acids are not gluconeogenic, so they cannot form glucose, but they are an important source of energy. They undergo beta oxidation in the mitochondria. And just as an example of how much energy we can get from one of these molecules of fatty acid, of 129 molecules of ATP can be formed from 1 molecule of palmitate. Palmitate happens to be a 16-carbon fatty acid. And the exact type of fatty acid that is broken down will depend on the type that has been stored in the body. But again, just to give you an idea, 129 molecules, significantly greater than the 32 that we talked about, 32 molecules of ATP that's derived from glucose oxidation. We'll briefly now just talk about the different muscle fiber types and the energy metabolism that occurs in those muscle fiber types. ATP is required for muscle fiber contraction. It's also required for calcium sequestration in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The speed of muscle contraction is related to the myosin ATPase activity, as well as contractile fibers and the enzymes that sequester calcium. Different muscle fiber types preferentially use glycogen and/or triglycerides. Muscle fibers that are type 2 fibers are called fast-twitch fibers. They derive energy both from glucose and glycogen. They have 2 to 3 times greater glycolytic activity compared to type 1 muscle fibers. They have higher concentrations of glycogen as well as creatine phosphate. They also generate 2 to 3 times more power than type 1 muscle fibers. Glycolysis will occur in the cytoplasm, and the process of glycolysis does not require oxygen, so these muscles can continue to contract in an anaerobic environment. Our type 1 muscle fibers are our slow-twitch fibers. They'll derive energy using both glycogen and triglyceride as substrates. So they have a more efficient production of ATP compared to our type 2 fibers. They have both the use of aerobic and anaerobic metabolism. They have a lower glycogen concentration, and they will metabolize fatty acids in the mitochondria. Remember, that's the only place where fatty acids will actually be metabolized. Type 1 fibers contain more mitochondria than type 2 fibers, and if we think about it, that should make sense. Type 1 fibers use fat or fatty acids as an energy source, so they should have more mitochondria because that's where fat is metabolized. Type 1 fibers also contain more myoglobin and have more capillaries than type 2 fibers, and that should also make sense because these types of fibers require oxygen in order to have fat metabolized in the mitochondria, oxygen is going to be required. So just some general ideas about the different muscle fiber types that we'll see in our equine athletes. Now, every muscle fiber or every muscle type, every muscle in the horse will have these combinations of different muscle fiber types. So both fast and slow twitch fibers will be in all muscles. But research has found a higher percentage of type 2 fibers in thoroughbred horses compared to Arabian horses. And I think if we think about the types of activities that thoroughbreds do compared to Arabian horses, it might make sense to us. We think about our thoroughbreds as maybe our jumping horses and certainly as our flat racing horses compared to Arab horses that tend to do more of our long endurance type of racing, type 2 versus type 1 muscle fiber type. That might make sense. A little bit of additional research has shown that glycogen depletion patterns vary with exercise in different types of type 2 fibers. There's a type 2A, which is a high oxidative, versus a type 2X, which is a low oxidative type of fiber. We won't go into that detail in this lecture, but if anyone is interested, there has been additional research that has been done within muscle fiber types. Conversely, compared to thoroughbreds, Arabian horses have a higher percentage of type 1 fibers compared to thoroughbred horses. The depletion of glycogen from type 1 fibers varies with the type of exercise, endurance versus a sprinting exercise. So endurance, you would expect the glycogen to be depleted a little bit more slowly because in endurance exercise, those animals are going to be relying more on fatty acid metabolism than purely glucose that's derived from glycogen. And finally, the muscle fiber distribution can actually be changed with training. Next, we'll talk about the nutrient requirements of exercising horses. We'll begin with a discussion of the requirements of water. Horses that have a light activity only require a slight increase in their water intake. It's very close to maintenance. But as a horse's athletic activity increases, their water requirements will increase as well. It's been found that horses that have competed in a 50 to 100 mile endurance ride have lost 3.6 to 7.7% of their body weight, and much of that that weight loss has been loss of body water. Horses working in hot weather have an hourly sweat loss of approximately 1.5 liters per 100 kilogram of body weight. Horses that are working in hot and humid weather have double the loss of body water, somewhere between 2 to 2.5 liters per 100 kilogram of body weight per hour when they're working at a submaximal level. When those same horses are moved to a cool, dry environment, when the humidity is removed and when the heat is removed, then their water loss is reduced to 1.5 liters per 100 kilogram of body weight, again at submaximal exercise. So the take-home point here is that total water intake can be 2 to 3 times greater than at maintenance, and these horses may need 36 to 92 liters a day. So it's essential with our equine athletes that we ensure that our owners are providing their horses with adequate stores of fresh water, especially if these horses are being trailered to shows, are being moved throughout the country to different athletic activities, especially if it's in the summer with really hot weather, that the horses are getting adequate periods to drink during their trailering, that they're getting adequate electrolytes, and that they're able to maintain their hydration not only when they're working, but also when they're being shipped in order to arrive at their destination and remain healthy. Next, we'll discuss energy, and the requirements of a working horse will depend on the duration of the exercise as well as the intensity of the exercise. And here we not only have to look at how fast the horse is working, but also at the type of work that they're doing. What is the ground resistance that the horse is traveling over? Are they traveling over sand or a hard surface? Are they working at an incline? How much weight are they carrying? What is the number and maybe the height of the jumps that they're working at? And so to determine the energy requirements of a working horse, we not only need to consider the maintenance energy, but also the exercise energy for that animal. Also remember that a horse will have an additional energy requirement during trailer transport. Now, there's not a specific equation to calculate how much energy a horse will require when they're being trailered, but in order to help maintain their balance when they're being trailered, additional energy will need to be provided. And so if you have a horse that's being trailered frequently in order to get to shows, you may have to talk to your client in order to have them provide a little bit of additional energy so that horse won't lose weight during their frequent show season. The actual amount of energy that an individual animal requires is difficult to estimate, and so it's a good idea, as always, to look at the animal, look at the ration, and evaluate the animal based on their body weight and body condition score to help determine whether or not what the horse is actually consuming is adequate for that animal. When we're thinking of an animal, a horse that's working, we can look at the heart rate during their exercise, and we can use that to help assess the intensity that the horse is working at. The energy requirement is going to be related to oxygen consumption, and the following chart helps to illustrate that. On the left column, we have the heart rate in beats per minute. In the center, we have oxygen utilization in liters per minute. And finally, on the right-hand column, we have energy utilization in kilocalories per minute. Looking at the top row, at a fairly light level of work, we have 60 beats per minute, and at that level, we'd expect the horse to use approximately 24 kilocalories per minute. Now, going all the way down to the most intense level of exercise, where a horse's heart would be beating at 180 beats per minute. Now, a horse can't maintain this level of intense work for very long. They'll tire very quickly. This would be an anaerobic state of work. Before too long, this horse would require 47.3 liters of oxygen per minute, and this just can't be maintained for very long. But that horse would require 230 kilocalories per minute. So again, this is just to remind you that the amount of energy that a horse requires is really related to the heart rate, and that can be related also to the oxygen consumption. In order to actually calculate the nutrient requirements during work, we can look to the NRC for the different equations that it provides. And the NRC gives us 4 categories for work intensity. We have light exercise, and all of these values are given, again, in digestible energy in megacalories per day. So light exercise, and that would be for horses that are being ridden recreationally, and maybe horses that are just being shown occasionally. That would be equal to 0.0333 times a horse's body weight, and that's the maintenance energy equation, times 1.2. Horses that are working at a moderate level, and those would be horses, again, recreational riding, but maybe a little bit more frequently. Horses that are more frequently showing. Horses that are working as polo ponies, maybe not very intensely. Horses that are doing some ranch work, maybe school horses. Those horses, again, in megacalories per day, the equation equals 0.0333 times a horse's body weight, and that factor times 1.4. For horses that are working at a heavy level, and those would be, again, horses working at ranch work, again, more heavy work. Polo ponies working more heavily, show horses that are working frequently or at strenuous levels, low to medium level eventing horses, and horses that are in the middle stages of race training. The energy requirements for those horses in megacalories per day equals 0.0333 times a horse's body weight times a factor of 1.6. And finally, our very heavy working horses. There aren't a lot of horses that work at this level, but some of our elite eventing horses, our racing horses would also be at this level, that are undergoing very heavy training and that are actively racing. The digestible energy requirements for these horses in megacalories per day is equal. Now here we have a different factor for the basic energy requirement of 0.0363 times a horse's body weight times a factor of 1.9. So again, these values provided by the NRC can be used in order to get an estimate of what the horse's energy should be provided in their ration. Use it as a guideline, and then monitor the horse for weight loss or weight gain. Evaluate the horse's body weight as well as their body condition score. And realize when you're looking at the horse that depending on the horse and their phenotype, their body condition score may look a little bit different. Quarter horses will have an increased muscle mass, so you're going to have to take that into account. Endurance horses will lose body condition score with increased exercise intensity. It's very rare to find an endurance horse that's actively exercising and training that's going to be at a body condition score of 6. Sometimes it's hard to find them at a body condition score of 5. Some of the endurance horses you may see may be at a body condition score of 4, and that may be about as high as they can get. Again, depending on the types of horses you work with, you'll probably get to be fairly comfortable with the body condition scores of that particular group of horses. Next, we'll discuss protein. Our working horses require additional protein in their ration to help repair damaged muscle and also to promote muscle development as they continue to work and exercise. And the requirements that we calculate will assume that additional protein is required for muscle tissue deposition and to replace nitrogen that's lost in sweat. Now, what you need to remember when you look at this slide and when you're looking at your notes is that the values here and the equations here is for the calculation of extra protein in excess of the actual requirements. So what you do is you calculate the requirement of protein for the horse. Then you make this calculation and add it to the horse's protein requirements. Okay, and so we have our 4 different categories again: light exercise, moderate exercise, heavy and very heavy exercise. And we take our horse's body weight, and you have a different factor here for every different level of exercise. And let me just call your attention to the NSF value, which is nitrogen sweat factor. And this accounts for, or tries to account for, the amount of nitrogen that's going to be lost as the horse sweats. And the nitrogen sweat factor will increase as the horse's work increases. And that's a little bit difficult to estimate. And what I'd recommend if you're doing work with performance horses is that you use the NRC balancing program that you can find on the internet through the National Academies Press website, and that information has been provided in your notes. And you actually put in the horse's body weight, and you put in its level of work, and then the protein value that's calculated by that balancing program that's free and online will actually include not only the maintenance protein, but this extra protein as well as the nitrogen sweat factor. Okay, so just again, as a reminder, these equations here are to be added to the maintenance protein that the horse requires. This is extra protein needed in excess of the horse's regular requirements. Okay. So a couple of points that I think we need to make about adding protein to the ration of a performance horse. Adding protein is good, and we want to certainly make sure that horses meet their protein requirements. We don't ever want to provide too low of a protein level, because then horses will just use up their own body stores of protein. But the other thing we don't want to do is provide too much excess protein, especially in the ration of an equine athlete. And why is that? Excess dietary protein that's not used will be excreted as urea. And that requires that the horse drink additional water, because additional water will be required for urea production. So that means the horse is drinking more. They'll be carrying around more water that has to be at some point excreted, not only in their urine, but also they'll probably have excess that they're excreting in the feces, and they'll have an increased evaporative loss. Heat will be produced in the production of urea, so that heat will actually have to be dissipated along with the excess heat that the horse is making when they're exercising. There'll be an increase in nitrogenous waste, so you can imagine if you have an equine athlete in a stall and they're urinating out a lot of excess nitrogen, then you're going to have a stall that not only needs to be cleaned more often, but you may have additional problems with respiration and what the horse is actually smelling if the horse stall is not cleaned as frequently. And you're also going to have a decrease in urinary tract pH. So while adding some supplemental protein is good, we don't want to overload the ration with excess protein. And by some supplemental protein, I would say if you have formulated a ration and you've calculated how much the NRC says you need, you can probably have an overage of maybe 200 to 300 grams, but you don't want to have 700, 800 grams above what the horse requires. Try and keep it fairly close to what the horse requires. Again, every animal will be a little bit different as far as their digestion and absorption of nutrients. So I usually do go a little bit over what I've calculated, because you never quite know how much an animal will be able to metabolize. If you don't have a forage analysis, you may not know the digestibility of the forage that the horse is eating also. And so you also want to make sure that you're providing forage and enough protein in the ration to make sure that the horse is getting adequate protein, especially if the forage is not as digestible as you think it may be. Okay, so what are some ways we can increase a dietary protein? We can feed a high quality, highly digestible forage. We can offer the horse fresh grass if that's available in the management conditions for the animal. We can provide alfalfa hay or alfalfa-based commercial feeds. We definitely want to limit feeding an all alfalfa-based diet to endurance horses. And then we can supplement with powdered casein, whey, or soy protein. And using a powdered protein supplement can be beneficial for our equine athletes. It doesn't add a lot of volume, but can add a nice concentrated source of protein to the ration. Our next macronutrient is lipid, and it's very helpful to add lipids and oils to the ration of a performance horse. Remember that triglyceride stores serve as an important energy reserve for our athletes, and it's especially beneficial when a horse is working in an aerobic environment. Metabolic adaptations to utilize fat efficiently are important. We'll discuss that in just a bit. Research has shown that horses that have lipid in their ration have a decreased plasma lactate after a standard exercise test, and standard exercise tests will be abbreviated as SET in the slides. They also have a decrease in heat production. There's less water required for the metabolism of lipid compared to other macronutrients. And the fecal volume is reduced when fat is used as a calorie source. Fat is twice as energy dense as both protein and carbohydrates. So if you add oil to the ration, you can provide more calories in a very dense, concentrated form that doesn't require a lot of fecal volume. Fat supplementation during prolonged low-intensity exercise decreases exercise-associated declines in plasma glucose concentrations. So that has a glucose-sparing effect. So again, when we add fat, plasma glucose doesn't go down as rapidly, and so the horse has more glucose that it can use over a longer period of time. This particular study showed an increase in the triacylglycerides and free fatty acids, as we would expect, because the horse is going to be using the triacylglycerides and free fatty acids as nutrient sources during exercise. This effect seemed to be associated with low-intensity exercise. In this particular study, the metabolic adaptation to dietary fat was important. This study showed that a 3 to 5 week adaptation period wasn't as effective compared to the horses that were fed fat for 10 to 12 weeks. The horses that were fed fat for a prolonged period of time had a better adaptation to utilize fat. They were more efficient utilizers of fat, and they had a better glucose-sparing effect than the horses that just had fat added for a little bit of time. The metabolic response was transient, so continued fat supplementation was necessary. And so that means if you have a horse that's training and competing and has fat in its ration, and in the off season, the horse is taken off the fat supplement to prevent weight gain. The next spring, when the horse is returned to work, that beneficial glucose sparing effect of the fat supplementation won't be there, so you'll have to re-add the oil to the diet and then start the horse back with that adaptation period in order to try and get that beneficial effect again. And currently, there's no defined requirement for oil in a ration of an equine athlete, but I think most nutritionists would agree that providing fat in some form is beneficial. A number of other studies have looked at the effects of adding oil or fat to the ration of an athlete. One study looked at using a post-exercise diet that had either non-structural carbohydrates or canola oil, and they found that without a fat adaptation period, there was a slower rate of glycogen repletion in muscles compared to the repletion rate after 3 weeks of fat adaptation. So again, using or having a period of fat adaptation was beneficial in this case for glycogen repletion. Another study found that saturated fat and unsaturated fat was looked at as coconut oil, unsaturated fat was looked at as soy oil, can be fed without adversely affecting the results of a standard exercise test and an oral glucose tolerance test. Remember that saturated fat is more susceptible to oxidation, and so that may alter whether or not you select a particular fat. Omega-3 fatty acid supplementation seemed to have beneficial effects in some metabolic parameters with exercise. It resulted in a lower heart rate, lower PCV, as well as a lower blood glucose concentration. Some potential benefits of feeding fat to the equine athlete. Improved power to weight ratio, so there's less GI tract fill, less forage intake, but you're still getting the calories in. And when some of the horses that are working at a heavy or very heavy level, you're going to have calorie requirements up in the 30 to 36 megacalorie range. And it's next to impossible for a high level working horse to actually eat enough feed, especially as forage, to get that many calories in. So adding fat, which is almost equivalent to 2 megacalories per cup of oil, you can really provide a lot of calories in a very small volume, and you can help not only meet energy requirements, but it really decreases the volume of feed that the horse is eating and then they have to carry around as a ballast within their GI tract. You also have a decreased metabolic heat production. There's increased stamina due to glycogen sparing, and improved sprint performance due to enhanced use of energy from anaerobic glycolysis. So there are a lot of good benefits to adding fat, and it's something you should consider when you're formulating the ration of an equine athlete. Next, we'll say a few brief words about carbohydrates. Although many times we talk about carbohydrates as being deleterious to the ration of a horse, with our athletes they do become important. Supplemental dietary energy as non-structural carbohydrates is often required. It's a palatable source of calories. They do need to be available during exercise to prevent fatigue. Remember, glycogen is an important energy source for our equine athletes. We want our horses to have plenty of glycogen stored in their muscles so that they can use that glycogen throughout their exercise, whether they're working in an aerobic or an anaerobic environment. While carbohydrates are important, we want to make sure our owners understand that horses are not people, and we do not want to carbohydrate load our horses. I think as veterinarians we understand that, but we also want to make sure our owners, especially our novice horse owners, understand that as well. It's very unsafe to make any rapid changes in the ration of a horse. Overfeeding of soluble carbohydrates is just dangerous in horses. We don't want to do that. And then certainly we know a number of equine muscle diseases where feeding carbohydrates can make the muscle diseases worse. And so we have to be wise when we think about using carbohydrates in equine rations at any time, but especially when we're thinking about our athletes. We need to use them cautiously and use them, but be aware of when we're using them and why we're using them. As an example, glycogen repletion seems to be more rapid in horses fed a diet of forage and non-structural carbohydrates as grain. Again, we do want our horses to have a repletion of those glycogen stores. And so while we've talked about many different conditions and times where we don't want horses to either gain weight, or whether we may have a horse with a metabolic syndrome where we don't want them to have excess carbohydrates, our athletes absolutely need a certain amount of carbohydrates in order to replete their glycogen, and so they are a good thing in the ration. How frequently and how close to an athletic event we feed our horses becomes important, and so let's just mention that quickly. Horses fed forage, grain, or a grain and forage before a standard exercise test was evaluated, and horses that were fed grain in their ration had a decreased plasma-free fatty acids, lower plasma volume, higher lactate, higher heart rate, higher blood glucose disappearance during exercise. So the authors in this particular study concluded that grain should be withheld from horses before exercise, but hay can be fed. And they recommended that the volume of non-structural carbohydrates should be limited within 4 hours before exercise. So again, horses, they suggested that hay could be offered, but that any feeds that had grain in them should be withheld 4 hours prior to exercise. They also noted that there was an increase in GI tract fluid following the consumption of these non-structural carbohydrates, and then that could potentially be deleterious for the horse as well and result in increased weight being carried around during the athletic activity. High-fat oats have been identified as a possible alternate energy source that may be safer than regular oats. They tend to have a lower starch and a higher energy and may result in a decreased blood insulin. They are not widely available, but if you find them, they might be a potential source of a safer carbohydrate source for your clients. Thinking about the benefits of sugar and starch compared to high-fat diets. Again, just in general, high-fat diets resulted in less glucose used in low-intensity exercise, whereas sugar and starch diets decrease insulin sensitivity and glucose tolerance. So, while we have some benefits to feeding carbohydrates, we don't want to overfeed them. Using both a combination of fat as well as carbohydrates is what we want to try and achieve in the ration in order to provide an optimal diet for equine athletes. For vitamins, we don't have a lot of good estimates for vitamin requirements during work. The NRC has estimates between maintenance as well and pregnancy and lactation. So the values that are provided in the NRC are somewhere between those two different life stages. Vitamin E is a particular nutrient that I think is worth mentioning. There is increased oxidative stress during exercise, and there have been some estimates that horses that are working do have increased vitamin E requirements. It's thought to be possibly as high as 300 international units per kilogram of dietary dry matter. The NRC from 2007 has a value of 2 international units per kilogram of body weight for heavy and very heavy exercise. It's probably reasonable if you're dealing with an equine athlete to ensure that their vitamin E is meeting these higher requirements. Natural vitamin E is the source that you would want, so that's the D alpha tocopherol, not the DL. You want to stay away from the synthetic form. It is not very bioavailable in horses. Okay, so vitamin E, again, a natural antioxidant, will be beneficial for our equine athletes. Vitamin C, another natural antioxidant. It's water-soluble vitamin. It's thought to maybe be beneficial in working horses, but we don't have a good estimate about the concentration that should be added in the ration. Horses don't require vitamin C because they're able to make their own. Can it be added as a supplement? It can. Could it be beneficial? Possibly. And so if you wanted to add vitamin C, maybe 1 or 2 grams, possibly, there is no good guideline for use. And so if you wanted to add it, that would be your decision. Does it have to be added? Not necessarily. For minerals, there are higher mineral requirements of both macro and trace minerals compared to maintenance, and I'll refer you to the NRC specifically for that. Again, I'd recommend that you use the balancing program on the computer in order to get the specific requirements if you are trying to balance a complete ration for an equine athlete. Just give a few words finally about electrolyte supplementation. Because our equine athletes are going to be working and sweating, and because horses do lose a significant concentration of electrolytes in their sweat, it is very important to ensure that horses are getting adequate electrolytes in their ration. So potassium, sodium, and chloride are the main electrolytes that are lost in sweat. Most forages will contain adequate potassium, so additional supplementation is usually not required. It can be added in many electrolyte supplements that you'll find that are marketed do contain potassium. Certainly using basic salts can be a way that you can provide electrolyte supplementation without having to use a commercial product. A number of studies have looked at the benefits of electrolyte supplementation in horses that are exercising. One study found that horses that were supplemented with sodium and potassium chloride had an increased water intake after they were supplemented. Another study found that when glycerol was added to electrolyte supplementation, there was no benefit that was found. And so, yet one other study found that providing a horse with an electrolyte supplemented fluid actually may help the horses replenish their muscle glycogen after exercise compared to when the horses were provided plain water. And so providing electrolytes to horses following exercise, especially this would be if we were thinking of 3-day eventing horses, when we want those horses to replenish their glycogen stores because they're going to be working again the very next day, that may be something beneficial. So think about talking to your clients about this. Again, I'll just bring up the point about horses that are being trailered, especially in the hot summer months where they may be sweating in a trailer. It may not always be something that clients are thinking about. You don't want to provide electrolytes to horses when they don't have water available. That's kind of the one caveat to this. Electrolytes are good, but if you are not providing the horse with adequate water, like in a trailering situation, providing excess electrolytes could actually be detrimental. So you have to balance out providing electrolytes with actually providing adequate water stores. We'll finish the lecture with a brief discussion about how to manage horses that have selected muscle diseases. We'll begin with a discussion of polysaccharide storage myopathy, or PSSM. And just as a brief background, we see PSSM mainly in quarter horse, paint, Appaloosa, warm blood, and draft breeds, although it can be seen in other horses. It's evident with muscle cramping as well as increased muscle enzymes. Horses that have PSSM1 have an increased muscle glycogen content, and they have a glycogen synthase 1 mutation in about 80% of the cases. They have an increase in insulin sensitivity, increased glycogen production as well as storage with increases in glycogen synthase. They don't have an increase in their glycogen branching enzyme though, and so they form an abnormal glycogen molecule, and they're unable to break apart all of the glycogen that they need, and so they store the glycogen but they're unable to access it, and so they fatigue easily, and in order to manage them nutritionally we need to alter their ration to prevent this excess glycogen storage and to also provide them with an alternate energy source. So the management, there are a couple different ways to do that. First, we have to think about managing them from a musculoskeletal standpoint, and I don't go into that in this lecture, but they need regular exercise. From a nutrition standpoint, one of the key components to this is to limit their intake of non-structural carbohydrates, which abbreviated as NSC. We want to provide their energy requirements as forage, with their NSC at about 17% or lower. We want to ensure that they're getting adequate vitamin and mineral supplementation. Vitamin E is going to be important with these horses, so make sure they get adequate vitamin E in their ration. Because we're not providing them with a lot of calories from non-structural carbohydrates or grain, we're going to be replacing those calories with calories from fat. And so we're going to be providing somewhere between 10 to 13% of their digestible energy from fat. And there are a couple different philosophies in the literature as far as how much fat to add to the ration, and I usually start conservatively somewhere between a half to 1 cup of oil per day. Now, you may have a client that actually has a genetic diagnosis of PSSM. You may have clients that have a presumptive diagnosis, but they actually don't want to have all the testing done. So even if you have a client that doesn't want to have the testing done, but you have a presumptive diagnosis of PSSM, I think it's fair to modify the ration, start with a half a cup of oil per day, start gradually, and see how the horse responds. If you've taken the non-structural carbohydrates, remove them from the ration, at least the vast majority of them, start with a half a cup of oil per day, see how they respond, and then gradually increase the volume up to a cup of oil per day if the horse requires that. When you're selecting an oil, it's very important to consider the essential fatty acid composition of the oil. Consider using an oil that has a higher concentration of omega-3 fatty acids compared to omega-6 fatty acids. Remember, oils like flax oil that have a higher concentration of omega-3 fatty acids produce less inflammatory mediators than oils like corn oil. I tend to avoid corn oil as much as I can. And so oftentimes I'll use a combination of flax and canola oil, maybe a half cup of flax. And if I have to go up to a full cup of oil per day, I'll go a half cup of flax, half cup of canola oil. Anytime you're using fat, remember that fats that are stored for a long period of time can become rancid. This is especially true during the hot and humid summer months. Oil ideally should be stored in the refrigerator. If that's not possible, a cool environment that's dark would be best. But anytime a horse is fed a feed that's rancid, they will have oxidative damage within their cells. That's been studied and identified before. So avoid feeding rancid feeds. Try and make sure that the oil is as fresh as possible. And that's one area where the natural antioxidant feeding vitamin E is going to be beneficial. There's some commercial feeds that can be used in order to help manage polysaccharide storage myopathy. Purina Ultium, KER Relieve, TDI Competition Conditioner. There are a whole variety of feeds. This is not an extensive and exclusive list. What you want to do is check the non-structural carbohydrate concentration of whatever feed you're choosing. Check with the company if you're not sure about that value. You may have to call the company to find out the energy density of the feed, but that information you can get from the company. And finally, we'll end with a couple comments about recurrent exertional rhabdomyolysis, or RER. This primarily affects thoroughbreds, especially mares that have those nervous horses and fillies. We tend to see clinical signs in those horses more commonly. It appears to have a genetic component, and horses tend to present with mild to severe muscle cramping of major muscle groups. It's thought to be a defect in intracellular calcium regulation, and horses that have an underlying lameness may be predisposed to RER. Fortunately, as veterinarians and as nutritionists, the management of horses with recurrent exertional rhabdomyolysis is almost exactly the same as horses that have PSSM. Minimizing stress during work is going to be important for these horses, and again, that falls more under a general management area. But from a nutritional standpoint, we want to limit the intake of non-structural carbohydrates for these horses as well. It's probably not quite as important as for the PSSM horses, but we still want to reduce the concentration in the ration. We want to provide the energy requirements using forage. We want to ensure adequate vitamin and mineral supplementation, and with these horses, because they do tend to sweat a lot, we want to make sure they're getting adequate electrolytes, and so evaluate the ration. If they're not getting electrolyte supplementation, make sure they're getting that, as well as vitamin E. I want to supplement the diet with fat calories. I follow the same guidelines as I explained for PSSM horses, starting with a half to 1 cup of oil per day. I have never had to go up to 2 cups of oil per day on any horse, except for possibly a draft horse. I just don't think you need to go up to 2 cups a day. That's 2 cups or a pound of oil a day is a very, very high concentration. One thing you always need to make sure of when you're using oil in any horse ration, especially if you're dealing with a horse with muscle disease, is you don't want to cause the horse to become obese, and that's why I recommend starting at a low concentration. You titrate the oil up until you get a clinical response, and then you hold the level at that volume. And you just want to monitor the horse to make sure they don't become obese. Again, ensure that you're looking at the fatty acid composition of the oil. Check to make sure it's not becoming rancid. And then the commercial equine feeds that are listed for RER are the exact same ones I've listed for PSSM. These are not the complete list. There are a long list of feeds that would be appropriate. Check with the different feed companies. Triple Crown actually has a whole variety of feeds that have a very low concentration of non-structural carbohydrates. Depending on what region of the country you work in and where your clients are buying their feed, you may find that there are a variety of different feeds from manufacturers in your region that would be appropriate for horses that have either PSSM or RER, and then you can build a ration using forage, oil, vitamin E, as well as electrolytes, and then the commercial feed that your client has selected. That ends the lecture. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me.